Yeah. In fact, it has much more to do with freedom of liturgy and how freedom of liturgy may be treated in a society which happens to have many kinds of religions that happen to have many kinds of worshiping. So in this case, the United States Supreme Court delivered a very interesting decision, and I myself, I belong to a state in Brazil, Bahia, which happens to have several religions that come from Africa, like Candomblé and Umbanda. Like Candomblé and Umbanda. Here in the United States you have something like, I think, Santeria? Santeria. So the case that was analyzed by the United States Supreme Court was a case of a Santeria religious ceremony. And how did the Supreme Court decide? Let's see here. I was glad to notice how the United States Supreme Court upheld the fundamental right of religion in this case. And also, we have to say that freedom of religion, as the freedom of worship, of liturgy, or the freedom of conscience, or the freedom to create religions, we have to say that this provision, especially in the Brazilian constitutional system, this provision comes to be a constitutional principle. Remember the first class here that we made a distinction between constitutional roles and constitutional principles according to the doctrine of Ronald Dworkin. And Ronald Dworkin says that there are constitutional rules and constitutional principles, and freedom of religion is a perfect example of constitutional principle, because you are not supposed to make a protection towards freedom of religion and forget all other provisions of the Brazilian Constitution or even the American Constitution. But here again, let me tell you how the United States Supreme Court delivered the decision. If the city is concerned about improper disposal of animal remains, it could have imposed general rules governing disposal of organic garbage. If the city were really concerned about how animals are treated while in confinement, it could regulate that regardless of the motivation for confining the animal. Instead, the city chose to prohibit possession of animals only if the purpose was sacrifice. The city stated that if wanted to prevent cruelty to animals, but it allowed many types of animal death for non-religious reasons, such as fishing, extermination of mice in their home, and the infliction of pain in the interest of medical science. The law allowed the use to leave rabbits to train greyhounds. This non-neutral law was not of general applicability, could not be justified on the grounds that it advanced interests of the highest order, and was not narrowly drawn to meet such interests. It's a very interesting decision that was delivered by the American Supreme Court, and it was amazing for me to notice how the decision may be applied here. Obviously, it ought to be applied here, but it may be applied in the very controversial issue, the very same controversial issue in Brazil. Because the way that the United States Supreme Court decided the case fits perfectly to the controversial issue which is happening also in my country, in Brazil. Also, we have to analyze freedom of liturgy in terms of conflict of rights of neighborhood. How would you feel if you lived nearby a church and this church would accomplish ceremonies, noisy ceremonies, until 5 o'clock in the morning? How would you react? How would you react? What would you do? How may we decide this hard case? That's a hard case. Also, animal sacrifice was a very hard case. But this is also a hard case. How would you decide that? How would you file a class action lawsuit in order to provide the protection of the neighborhood? That's very interesting, but also very delicate issue. Again, in terms of freedom of religion controversies, we have to ponder over the fundamental rights that are being applied. Here we have the fundamental, the basic right of the neighborhood for resting and sleeping. But you also do have the right of the church to worship, to exercise its freedom of religion. In Brazil, the state public prosecution filed a class action lawsuit in order to provide the resting and sleeping of the neighborhood. But the state public prosecution did not forget the freedom of religion, because even when you are the plaintiff, you are not supposed to forget the right or the fundamental right of the defendant. If you are a prosecutor, you're not supposed to forget the other fundamental right, because You were an official. You were not a private law.